Andrea DeLong-Amaya is Director of Horticulture at the Lady Bird Johnson Wildflower Center. If you've been out there to the center and seen someone with a straw hat on, feverishly working, planting plants, it was probably Andrea. She has over 30 years of experience with Texas native plants, has been at the LBJ Center since 1998, teaches classes in horticulture, native plants, has been on many TV shows, written up in many publications, and I believe she's got a book coming out, Texas Native Plant Primer, to be published March of 2025. So she brings a world of experience to our most favorite native plant center in Texas, the Lady Bird Johnson, how forward-thinking she was so many years ago. So Andrea, welcome.
Thank you all very much. As folks are trickling back in, I just wanted to say thank you to our previous speakers, both of y'all. Mr. Nell, I really relate to your comments about how people are connecting with nature, you know, as compared to say connecting to nature, right? That really implies that there's a relationship, and I value that a lot, so thank you for that. Y'all have seen this before, right? It's not even funny because it's real. How many of you guys are gardeners, would consider yourselves gardeners? Little g doesn't have to be like serious gardening. Okay, so how many of you would not relate to being a gardener? So hopefully I have some little tidbits for y'all that you can use in your gardening. I like to start out with talking about what is a native plant. This is we're the Native Plant Society, right? But I find as I'm talking to folks how there's really so much diversity and opinion about what a native plant actually is. And it's actually a fairly complicated topic. It's kind of messy and very nuanced, but I have this shorthand that I think is helpful, and that would be a native plant is a plant that evolved naturally, that occurs naturally where it evolved. Now, if you go to England and you're on a British island and they've had people on the island since the last ice age, that's a very different thing, right? And of course, we know that early people in the Americas were moving plants around. So, and how every generation we know that there's evolution happening too. So it is a little bit messy, but I think that's a useful shorthand. It's also really important to look at geography. And when you're talking about a native plant, defining where the plant is native to. If you go to a garden center and you say, I'd like to have some native plants, you might get shown something like Joe Pyeweed, but if you live in West Texas, that's not probably an appropriate plant for you. So it's important to look at the whole state and realize that plants that are native to one region may or may not do well in another region. Some species are very versatile and might occur all throughout the state and have a wide range. Others might be very specific in the kind of conditions and locations that they grow. So keep that in mind. It's also important to think about what your purpose is. If you're gardening and you're just looking for plants that are going to be drought resistant, you might have a broader definition of what your range of native plant would be. So you're just looking for things that are drought resistant, you might reach into South Texas a little bit or West Texas. But if you're doing a restoration, you might want to be very specific. And I only want plants that are native to the Bull Creek drainage, if that's what you're working on. So those are important things, distinctions to think about. I think it's also helpful to define what a native plant is by thinking about what it isn't. What are these plants? These are things that you might see growing wild in your area. And these are not plants that are native to our area, even though you might find them growing in natural areas. These are what we would consider non-native plants, invasive species that have escaped cultivation or have escaped from, whether it's cultivation or maybe they were hitchhiking on a shoelace or whatever. But unfortunately, all three of these species I've seen for sale at garden centers, not necessarily around here, but These are things that we want to keep an eye out for. So just because something's growing wild doesn't mean that it's a native plant. And in fact, many of these can be extremely detrimental and outcompete the native plants that should be there, which then in turn diminishes the habitat quality for animals and everybody else who's relying on those native plants that are not there if they're being replaced. Here's another category. So when we're talking about native plants as the Native Plant Society, we're often thinking about the state, the political boundaries, which is somewhat arbitrary, right? We understand that there are ecoregions, and following ecoregions is probably a more ecologically sound way to define what a native plant is, but it's a lot harder to describe. You know, it's easier to say Texas, right? So here's some plants that are considered to be well-adapted species, but they're actually native, whoops. They might be actually native to Mexico. They might be not that far from where we are in some cases. And so they may be serving as appropriate garden plants. Again, they may not be the best for landscape restorations, but for gardens, they might be acceptable. And they're certainly, you know, if they're adapted to the heat and the soil and the water conditions that you have, that might be just fine. Just realize that that doesn't necessarily mean that they're native plants. Similar to, you know, if I'm in Austin and I'm growing a Sphaerosia from West Texas, it might do well for me, but it's actually not strictly native to where I'm growing those plants. And the main thing is to make sure that you're not going to be introducing an invasive species that's going to wreak havoc on your landscape. And then the final category of what often is confused for being native are wildflowers. You know, you might go to a garden center and buy a wildflower seed packet and assume that all of those plants are native, but that's not always the case, right? Native American seed is a really good, reputable source. They are Texas native species, but others may not. You might have things like cosmos or the rocket larkspur, some of these species which are native to Eurasia, which may or may not do well here, and in some cases do too well, like oxeye daisy, for example, which can be an invasive species for us. So these are plants that are exotic, but are still considered wildflowers. Okay, so I'm kind of preaching to the choir, I realize that. Here's a list of reasons why you might want to grow native plants. And just to go through them briefly, this might give you some fodder when you're talking to somebody else who hasn't quite gotten underneath our tent yet. Eliminating the potential for introducing invasive species, we just talked about that. One of the prime reasons that people, I find, use native plants is that they're trying to conserve water. You know, that's a critical resource in Texas, particularly, you know, as we continue to have drought. Really important reason for using native plants. Eliminating the need for soil amendments. And I usually say this word amendment with air quotes because amending your soil implies that there's something wrong with it, right? And really, the fact is, if you have soil, there are plants that will grow in it. You don't actually have to amend it. You might have a broader range of plants that you can grow in that situation if you do add more compost or decomposed granite or whatever it is that you're trying to do, but you don't have to. You really can. If you match the right plant to the right conditions, your need for extra inputs will be very minimal, and that's a wonderful way to conserve resources. And then disease and pest resistance. Our plants are adapted to the diseases and insect pests that we have in our area. That's not to say that they won't be impacted by invasive diseases and pests, so they are going to be less likely to succumb to them, though. Climate change, that's a big one. At the Wildflower Center, we have had a lot of people in the last few years come to replace a lot of the plants that they've lost in the last couple of winters. The freeze of 21 and then the ice storm of 23, people lost a lot of stuff. And what's interesting is, you know, we think of climate change, we used to call it global warming because the trend is that we're getting warmer over time. And we're seeing that over the last 20, 30, 40 years that a lot of species that are native to South Texas have come northward. In Austin, we have Retama, we have Weisach. These are things that didn't used to be so common, but with the general warming trend, we're seeing more of those species. But then we have these extreme weather events, the extreme cold and ice, and those plants really got knocked back quite a bit. So it's important to think about how it's not just the general trend of warming, but how the extremes are really going to impact the vegetation. And we found that the plants that are that have been native to a particular region have been more resilient, even with the extreme cold weather, as well as the warming and drought. Now, we don't know what's going to happen 20 or 30 or 50 years from now, but we'll have to wait and see. Resources for wildlife, this is an obvious one. I think everybody is familiar with, the fact that native plants and animals have evolved together, and so you're going to have a richer habitat if you are using native plants to support your native animals. And the more diverse plants that you have, the more diversity in wildlife you're going to have. And then this goes to what Steve Nell was talking about, preserving regional identity, botanical heritage, but also just reverence for our natural world. And I just really connect with that. I'm sort of a naturalist patriot. I want Texas to look like Texas. I don't want to go to the gas station and see boxwood. I want to see something that is speaking to our region and really celebrating our natural heritage. And native plants are just cool. They're beautiful in themselves. Okay, here's an exercise for you. If you imagine what a native plant garden looks like, what would it look like? What does a native plant garden look like? Maybe it looks like this. This is a wildflower planting. It's not a true meadow. It has a higher species, higher percentage of flowering plants versus grasses. A true grassland or true wildlife meadow would probably have 80 or 90% grasses and 10 to 20% forbs, flowering plants. So this is definitely a garden, even though it doesn't maybe look like a garden to most people, but this is what you might think of when you're thinking of a native plant garden, right? Okay, here's another example. This is, not so much a wildflower planting, but more of a organized garden, still fairly naturalistic. Another example. I didn't do that. So the point is that you can see how you can have a wide range of garden styles using native plants. So you don't have to have a naturalistic garden to be using native plants. If you're preferring something that looks a little bit more organized, or in this case, a little bit broader brush strokes where you have mass plantings of things, the landscape might be a little bit simpler and maybe read on a larger scale better. Smaller spaces, you can have more busyness happening without losing it. So just thinking about how you can use native plants in different kinds of garden styles is helpful, because what I don't like is when people say, oh, those native plants are messy. I don't want to use native plants because I don't want a wild garden. I don't want those snakes. You just assume that you're going to have snakes if you have a native plant garden. Not that a snake can't be anywhere. So I just think that's a really important thing to, here's just some more other pictures of, using native plants in a more formal design. Here we're demonstrating, there's geometry, the whole garden is a square bed, and then it has a circular lawn in the middle, and with a cross in the middle. So there's geometry, there's symmetry, it's bilaterally symmetrical, but it's also not just in the design of the space, but it's also with the maintenance. I'm a horticulturist. I have a lot of my horticulture staff here today, and they know that you are not going to be able to maintain a design of a garden unless the maintenance is in line with what the design intent originally was. So maintenance, you can change the garden design quite a bit. I would say half of your design is actually carried out through the maintenance of your landscape. So if you want to shear your shrubs very tightly, that's going to make it look a little bit more formal, and if you let them be looser and more airy, then it's going to look more naturalistic. I'm not saying one is better or worse, it's just a different taste, right? And if it's allowing people to use native plants in a landscape that might otherwise be turned off by the idea of having a wild garden, then great. We'd rather people just use those plants, right? So one way that I think people can use native plants is with containers. Sometimes if you don't own your own property, you're renting, or you maybe have, you're living in a, I don't know, an apartment complex and you don't really have land to cultivate, you can use plants in containers. Now, these are stock tanks that are fairly large, so maybe you can do something like this. It's fairly inexpensive. One of the advantages of these stock tanks is that you can build up. You don't have to, you know, if you're on limestone, you don't have to get too far into the soil. You just really want to make sure that those tanks are level. The other benefit to these is aesthetic, which is that you can have single species in each of those tanks, for example, or in any kind of planter, or you can mix them up if you want, but it does help you define the space a little bit. And then it also allows for some of us who are mobility impaired to not have to bend over as much. It makes it a little bit easier. So here's some ways that you might use native plants that is not something you might always think about. You can use native plants like the image on the right, which would be more like a flower arrangement. And what's cool about this, this container is big enough that you can have several species in there, and you can design it to be colorful in the spring. And in this case, we're using wine cups and other perennials that look great in the spring, and then when they're done, you can get out your rock dolly and go cart it behind the shed and keep watering it so it doesn't die. But you know, you can trim it back and maybe give it a little bit of care and bring it back out later when it looks good again. In the meantime, you might have a second container of things that are going to look, you know, more colorful or more interesting for the summertime, so you can move them around that way. But the beauty is, if you're using perennials, or even if you're using annuals that you let reseed into the pot, you're not having to replant that all the time. So that saves you money. It also saves resources, the plastic pots that you're not having to use to replant them all the time. And then the picture on the left shows you how you might use native plants in individual pots, and then use the whole collection as an arrangement to keep things interesting. And those are obviously also very versatile. You can move them around. One of the nice things about containers too is if you have small plants, a lot of our native plants, particularly in the drier parts of the state, tend to be small and can be very easily overwhelmed by more robust plants. You know, cacti, I think some of the little cacti would be great. Put those in a pot, you can elevate them, they're not going to be overwhelmed by their neighbors, so that's another really helpful way to use containers to support your native plant, your gardens. And this has been a while, but we've had a couple different times local chapters of the Bonsai Society do exhibits with us at the Wildflower Center. And it's not that they were bringing in these plants because they were native plants, or that they weren't making bonsais out of them because they were natives. It just happened that many of these do very well under plant torture. Yes, you can torture plants too, native plants. But it's not something that people think of using native plants for, right? So expand what you think of and how you might use native plants. You know, don't get in your square box too much. Turf grass is a big topic. I don't know, there's millions and millions of acres of turf grass in the United States, you know, equal to the size of some crazy state or something. And just thinking about the amount of resources that goes into supporting turf grass is kind of ridiculous, particularly water, but also pesticides, fertilizers, all that. And so the more that we can minimize the negative impacts that lawns have, the better. Many years ago, the Wildflower Center developed a blend of 3 or more native species of grasses that we call Habiturf. And they were selected because they have similar growing requirements, they stay short, they have a narrow leaf blade so they don't look like they're a bunch of different things, they look more normal, more uniform. And what the point is that you're not doing a monoculture, you're having a polycultural blend of plants, which gives them more resilience. So conditions from one year to another, or conditions on a particular site might favor one species or another. You know, you're gonna have more flexibility there. So that works pretty well. I will confess that the Habiturf is not super great with foot traffic. Heavy foot traffic it's not going to be as tolerant of that. And if you're curious to know more about it, we have some good information on the Wildflower Center website, so check that out. That'll tell you how to do it, and some of the studies that we did that showed how good it can be. Now, one of the interesting things about habiturf, or one of the components of habiturf is buffalo grass, which is more commonly available, and particularly with turf. You can buy buffalo as a turf sod. But this is where using ecology and understanding of the natural way that plants are growing and how you can use that information to become a better gardener. Buffalo grass is naturally a plant that doesn't have a very tight weave. There's a lot of gaps in it. It's really designed to form a matrix in which other plants, forbs, wildflowers, which they can grow in. So it doesn't have a real dense mat, allowing for those other plants to squeeze in. So what that means is if you're trying to do it as a lawn and you don't want to have weeds in your lawn, you're going to be struggling because it's designed for that, right? Now there are some different cultivars that are have a tighter weave that are more weed resistant, but that is actually a benefit that you might be able to play with, and I'm going to come back to that here in a minute. Let's see. How many of you guys have heard of clover lawns? It's a trend that's become popular in the last, 5 years or so, maybe a little longer than that. But the idea here is that you would oversee your lawn with clover. And in this case, white clover is the most common. Where's clover from? Where's white clover from? Europe. And if you planted white clover in your garden, then what kinds of habitat would you be, what kind of animals would you be supporting? European honeybees, right. So it's definitely a step up from just a mowed lawn, but if you're trying to really enhance your habitat, that's probably not the best thing. It would be much better if you could use native plants to support that. Let me go to the next one, which is no mow May. Have you guys heard of no mow May? This is another trend that started in Europe, in England, and again, I think the idea is good, but with some caveats, and that is if you have a very clean lawn and maybe you don't have a lot of weeds and you just decide you're not going to mow it for a month in May, what are you going to get? What are you going to get? A bunch of weeds? You might just get more grass. If you're starting with a pretty clean, weed-free lawn, you're going to have grass. Do grasses attract pollinators? No. They're wind dispersed. You're going to get more grass, right? And if you do have weeds in there, if you have weed seeds, you're going to have weed seeds producing plants. And most of those weeds are going to be the early colonizing annuals. If you're lucky, you might have some early colonizing annual natives, but often those are not going to be native. So if you stop mowing your lawn, generally you get a bunch of weeds. And if you let them reseed, then you're going to have more weeds. So this is why I don't think that's always the best idea. It might be better than just having, a very sterile lawn, but there are problems with that, particularly here. We're not England. I think in England they're not as compulsive about having a completely weed-free landscape lawn, and so you might actually have some native plants that come up from that. So here's what I think is the best, and that is to take a space that has grass in it, and maybe if you're lucky it's already existing and you just cultivate it or maintain it. But you can also plug in some of these smaller native plants that can tolerate being mowed or walked on even in some cases. So here we have the purple Mexican petunia, the Ruellia, several different species of Ruellias that do really well in different parts of the state. If you look below that, we have the horse herb or straggler daisy with the little yellow flowers. If you have shade, you probably already have this plant, and it makes a great ground cover. Scarlet pea, which I think is misnamed because it's really pink, not scarlet, but anyway, it's a beautiful, cute little ground cover. And then up at the top, we have the white rain lilies. Oh, I didn't mention, but actually this picture on the left has all of those species in there. So you may not see them if it's not raining or if you're not irrigating, but as soon as it rains or the weather shifts, you're going to start seeing some flowers. There's a lot more stuff in there too besides that. This is what the rain lilies look like. And what's fun about rain lilies that you probably know is that they're very ephemeral. They just show up, and which makes them special. They're not there all the time. You don't just get used to them. So when they come, you're like, oh, the rain lilies are blooming. How fun is that? I mentioned the horse herb. If you have shade, this is a great ground cover for shade. It's pretty tough and pretty pushy, so it's pretty resistant against other weeds. You might have a few other things coming in, but it's pretty good for having a fairly uniform look. You can mow it. If it goes dormant in the summer, if it's too dry, a little bit of water will bring it back to green. And the little flowers are a nice little bonus. They're not super showy, but they're there, and they will attract pollinators also. Some other ground covers, the horse herb again, then there's the silver ponyfoot on the top right. Bottom right, we have frog fruit, and then bottom left, we have woolly stemodia. These are all good ground covers that would be appropriate for lawn substitutes, particularly if you're not trying to make a running space for kids or dogs or whatever. But if you're just looking for a ground cover, these are great plants that will serve that purpose. And the ponyfoot, the frog fruit, and the stemodia, they propagate by runners or stolons. So they'll have trailing stems over the ground, and then they root at the nodes, which makes them really tough, very drought resistant. Also, they can take a little bit of foot traffic because of that. If some part of the plant gets damaged, then the rest of the plant can feed the parts that are damaged and rejuvenate from there. They also are really helpful for being used as what I call a living mulch or a green mulch. So instead of actually putting bark mulch or something around the base of a plant, you can actually use the plants. That saves you money in labor of having to put the mulch down, but it also is going to be providing more habitat for wildlife. Okay, wildflower meadows. This is like what everybody wants, right? Has anybody tried to do this? It's not that easy. You just think, oh, I'll just buy some seed and throw it out, and it'll be beautiful, right? Well, I talked a little bit about ecological succession earlier and how that can relate with gardening, and this is an extension of that. So actually, let me back up. So this picture here of bluebonnets, and actually the one before there, those are mostly annual species, right? Bluebonnets, Indian paintbrush, whatever DYC that is, it's probably an annual. Those are things that our early colonizers, their strategy is to go into a space that's been disturbed, stabilize the soil. Their strategy is very fast. They germinate, they grow, they bloom, make seed all within a season. It's a very fast thing. Live fast, die young. So if you just had that year after year, over time, you're gonna have weeds come in because most of the weeds are also annuals that have the same strategy, and they're just gonna come in and contaminate. And that's usually what happens with people's wildflower meadows, that over time, you lose the bluebonnets and you get more junk. So the way nature works is that over time, you'll have perennials that they're a little bit slower to get going, but over time, they're gonna get established. And as they grow, they're kind of pushing out the annuals as the annuals are starting to decline. So there's that natural transition from one to the other. So one way you can do this is to jumpstart it a little bit. This is a garden we did at the Wildflower Center many years ago. And you can see the image on the left where it's kind of plugged in. We actually just put plants in there, little plugs. And those are mostly perennials. And then in the meantime, while those perennials are growing, there's still some bare space. We threw out some annuals over that to fill in those gaps in the short term. And then over time, the perennials have filled in. And over time, actually past the picture on the right, time-wise, over time, those plants start moving around, they're seeding out, and it starts looking a little bit more natural looking. So that's gonna be a little more resource intensive, the cost of planting plugs, but it's an easier way to maintain a wildflower looking garden over a longer period of time. Okay, I'm gonna shift now to using native plants in rain gardens or swales. This is, if you're not familiar with the idea of a rain garden, basically it's a depressed part in your landscape where water collects, particularly when we get a lot of rain. And the point of it is to slow down the water, to get it to percolate into the soil, rejuvenate the groundwater, keep that water on your site as opposed to shedding it off as fast as you can, which is kind of the way most cities engineer their space. And that also helps with reducing downstream flooding by reducing the amount of sheet flow. Keeping it on your property is going to help with that. So you want to have plants that are tolerant of being dry when it's not raining and being wet, maybe even inundated for a little bit of time. So things like the Gulf muley, the pink muley, which is native to the coast, does really well. We also have palmettos in there, some fun different plants that you can grow. We have a bunch of native hibiscuses that like moist conditions. They tend to get fairly large, so give them some space. But what's nice about the mallows, the hibiscus and the mallow family, is they really like hot weather, and they'll bloom through the summer for you. This picture shows you a swale, and we didn't actually design it this way, but it turned out for various reasons that we had this low point in this garden bed that we were going to use some different plants in there, and then when we saw how it turned out, we realized, oh, we better shift that. So we used the topography of that garden bed to determine what species we were going to plant. So the bank there in the middle with the giant coneflower, Rudbeckia maxima, they really like that kind of moist area. So we put those in the lowest part and then planted the other stuff around it, and it did very well. So it's helpful to be able to use plants to solve landscape problems. Oh, wow, what's that? What the heck is that? I don't know. It's a lava dome. I don't know. Why is that there? It's not really relevant to this talk. I just thought it looked cool. So for those of you who knew Pat McNeil, if you had ever seen some of his presentations, I learned that dirty trick from him. He was notorious for throwing in random slides. I just liked it. Okay, let's move on. We lost Pat fairly recently, and I'm not going to go into a eulogy, although I'm tempted, but I just wanted to honor his service and his dedication and passion for native plants. We also lost several other folks recently, Jolynn Piercy and also Patty Manning, so honor to them. This idea of time sharing, I think, is really useful. So at the Wildflower Center, we're all native plants, all Texas natives. We're not using bedding plants, right? We can't just put in, I don't know, some begonias for some summer color or something. We're relying on the native plants to give us color throughout the year. So this idea is to use two, sometimes more, species in the exact same location that have different seasons that they're actively growing. So a classic combination would be Turk's cap or wax mallow that grows throughout the summertime, and then it freezes to the ground in the wintertime, and if you have nothing there, it's going to be dirt or mulch. So if you use something like giant spiderwort, then you have green through the winter and then flowers in the spring. By the time the spiderwort is giving it up for the season, they'll completely disappear. You'll think it's dead, but those roots are still in there. But that's around the time that the wax mallow or the Turk's cap is starting to come on. So you're able to have, to maximize your space, both for our own pleasure of looking at plants, but also for the wildlife. Another combination would be using the warm season Texas lantana combined with something perhaps like the pink evening primrose. Now, these combinations are very flexible. You can experiment with what works. You can use lantana with bluebonnets. So basically the point is to use a warm season plant with a cool season plant. And they can be perennials or annuals in a way to maximize the space. This is what it looks like in action. So the image that you see on the left shows you what that garden looked like in the spring. The plants on the right are all in the same picture. The plantings didn't change at all. They're just expressing themselves at different times of the year. So you can see the spring, we have pink evening primrose. It's a little hard to see, I think, but there's the giant ranunculus. We have some paintbrush in there. And you don't see it, but the Gulf muley is in there, and the prairie goldenrod is also in there. So in the fall, those grasses and the goldenrods start to show up. The other stuff is dormant or not really very visible. So this is how you can maximize what you're doing in a given space. I think it's really important to engage as many senses as possible. That's going to make a more dynamic garden. This is just garden design in general, but here's some plants that I think work really well for that. We have a lot of beautiful grasses in Texas, and any slightest breeze will get them to dance, and that just adds that liveliness to your garden. And then with light, grasses are also wonderful for capturing light. So backlit plants, if you spend more time in your garden, maybe in the morning, you have plants that are planted on the east side of your house that you can observe with the light coming through, or maybe it's the west side if you appreciate your garden more in the evening. But playing with those sort of things, not just flower color or even plant forms, but really using these dynamic qualities of these plants. Incorporating sound, water is music to the ears. It can muffle out other like highway noises, but just the trickling is very relaxing. Also, moving water is very attractive to wildlife, so they hear it and they'll come and look for that water source. The picture on the right, okay, cottonwood. I wouldn't probably recommend most people plant a cottonwood in their garden, but if you have enough space, put it in the back where it's not going to drop limbs on people's heads or cars. But it's a fun plant, and there are male and female plants, and if you get a female, you'll have snow in the middle of summer, which is fun. But regardless, both of them, these plants are related to poplars and aspen, and so with the breeze, those leaves will rattle together and it sounds like rain, and it's very cooling and very soothing. It's one of my favorite sounds in the middle of summer. We think about fragrance quite a bit, so that's an easy one for us to incorporate into the garden. So we have things like Damianita, which has fragrant foliage more than the flowers. The mountain laurel, which smells up everything, stinks it up real pretty like. Chocolate flower, chocolate daisies really do smell like chocolate. And then the kidneywood on the top, Texas kidneywood. Engaging in your tastes. This is really fun. This is one that I really have a lot of fun with. I will start by saying, be very careful when you eat plants. You want to make sure that you are 100% certain of the identification, because some of these plants can kill you. My motto is you can eat anything at least once. We played around with some different things, prickly pear, jelly, actually Minette, I think that's your handwriting. We had Texas persimmons, which are one of my favorite wild foraging plants just to eat straight off the plant. They are delicious. The salad up on the top was a special that our cafe did for us for an event, and it features 3 different native plants. So it has Texas pecan, which is a state tree of Texas. The purple vinaigrette dressing is made from prickly pear fruits, the tunas. And then we also had purslane, wild purslane in there. Yum. And then the devil's claw combined with garlic, which is not native here, or not that one anyway. And then the chili piquin, we did some devil's claw pickles, which are delicious also. Echinaceas, we have several echinaceas throughout the state, and 2 of the common ones that are used for tinctures, if you were to buy a bottle of this tincture, it might be dropping $25 or something. You can make your own for free with a little bit of work, not a lot, just a little. Echinacea purpurea and Echinacea angustifolia are 2 species that are commonly used for that. Anybody recognize this? Prairie tea, yes. Prairie tea, also called doveweed. This is a croton. Most people are going to look at this and say weed. They're going to scream weed, weed, weed. It's an annual plant, so it's an early successional species. You'll see it commonly in disturbed sites. It makes a wonderful, delicious tea. Okay, here's the shameless commerce section of the talk. The Wildflower Center is in the middle of doing our fall plant sales, and we're holding our plant sale this weekend and then 2 other weekends after this. So through the end of October, Fridays, Saturdays, and Sundays, you can go to our website for more details. We replenish our stock every weekend. And then, as was mentioned earlier, if you're interested in my ideas about gardening with Texas native plants, my new book will be coming out in March, so check that out. This is how we make our gardens here. These are the plants that tell us we're home.